remaining faithful here to the cause of a possible future. The New York infrastructure is crumbling. All our devices failed us. We just blew out a fuse, and it hasn't been a good morning. And we in New York have come to the conclusion that for the future, we're going 100% online, because it's harder and harder to get here. Renting a big room, because we thought it was going to be something like a class in the Marxist education project here. There's usually, but it is really a seminar, and so we don't need this place. And also the connection isn't good here, so it's costing us money every month to broadcast from here. So it worked fine last week, because there was also a heat problem here. So that's something else that's planned. Now, we've been talking over the format of what we're doing here. And Fred, why don't you present that?
Right.
Oh, he's busy over there. Okay. We've had requests from various people or expressions that we need to slow down. There's a lot of reading and a lot of work preparing those sources, and instead of rushing through these topics, it was suggested that for January, for the next semester, that we slow down and that we spend 2 weeks on each one. And that we devote more time to our actual. Good morning, Alexei. Alexei just came online in Russia. We're talking about, for next semester, the idea, and I would like to discuss it with you, of slowing down the rate at which we try to do these topics, because it's really a little bit too much, finding the readings, presenting them, just even doing the readings. The readings, by the way, were great for this particular topic, and so they really merit more time. So that was one of the suggestions, and the other part of it is that we need to focus more on getting the wiki, the topics up on the wiki, in terms of transforming them into something that is past the now of 2117, the future, and the process. So, Fred, why don't you explain this? You'll do it better than I do. Fred is busy doing something on the chat, which unfortunately I can't see because I'm too far from the screen. Okay, so I'm wondering how you feel about that in terms of your input. And of course, Sam, you're new to this, and it must seem a little bit chaotic to you. In fact, we have a broad and generally agreed plan. But this is talking simply about slowing down and devoting more time to converting the studies that we're doing, that is to say the research part of it, into material that transforms itself into this vision of then, now, and how. So I'm wondering if we don't want to start by interrupting to some, by now to do that, or should we do that starting in January? 3 more topics that have been posted online. And the next one, which would take place on what date, Fred?
The next session?
Yeah.
The 3rd.
The 3rd of December was the one on violence. And that's a very, very big topic. And then we go to the women's one, and that's all been set up. The team is working on it, and Silvia Federici is going to join us for that one. So what we're proposing is perhaps putting the violence topic off into the next semester and devoting our next meeting to continuing the discussion on organization, but also to start writing. That is to say, we'd have 2 weeks in which there's not much more reading to do, but the idea would be that each one of us take something out of the readings and transform it into either a vision of what might be, a vision of how it or just improvise one of your own and put it up there. So that's the proposition. Let's see now how people feel about it. It's really 2 parts. One is generally spending 2 weeks on the topic, and the other is to use that time to start generating product, basically. What people should raise their hands or signal on chat when they wish to talk. Otherwise, Fred, you were supposed to chair this meeting.
Well, no one has their hands up.
Right. Well, then let's go from right to left, or left to right. Who's the first one? Samuel. How do you feel about this proposal? He seems to have...
It's like Samuel has left the room.
He fled the room.
I think someone cut his microphone.
What did you say, Lola?
I don't know, something appeared saying that his microphone was off. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not able to unmute it here, so let's see if Sam?
He knows how to work.
Unmute your mic, please. Sam, faster.
Nothing, just go.
Okay, everyone, when you're ready to speak, unmute your mic.
Oh, yeah.
I already said what I thought.
Sam, it's not always chaotic like this. Truly. Normally the meeting starts.
Richard, I would like to say, I can barely make out what you are saying, so it's impossible to talk to it.
Oh, you can't hear?
Yeah, I hear you need to speak into a mic.
All right, but we thought we had this multi-directional mic that was going to do that. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Well, I wish you had stopped me sooner. And we didn't have a chance to do a mic check because we were behind times. Holy, this is really a shanda for the neighbors, you know? A new person, a very distinguished person, of a long-time militant and an actively engaged man of many struggles. And here he is, and we're caught with our technological pants down. Well, I apologize. It will get better next time. So briefly, what we're proposing is to not rush through these topics, but take 2 weeks to look at them. Because we're always rushed at the last minute and cramming for the session, those of us who do the reading thoroughly. And this way we'll have more time, and that extra hour, as was planned from the beginning, would be to create collectively, collective research and collective creation. So we just need to start putting stuff up, get into the habit of writing. And I thought that what we could do is start, or next time, 2 weeks from today, December 3rd, and continue the discussion of organization, but transform what we've learned into reports that go back in the then inspirations for what would be great in the now of 2117 and scenarios about how to get from here to there. So that's the proposition, and it has several parts. So I'd just like your quick or lengthy opinions on it. And Sam had asked to talk, and he's holding up a sign.
No, it's just a picture. It's a picture. It's his screensaver.
Oh.
Or his icon. I don't know if he's.
I think it's
Go ahead, Lola. We're listening.
what?
Speak, we're listening.
Oh, okay. I think it's a good idea to spend more time on each topic, and maybe this way also, if people have more knowledge into one topic, they might find it easier to find articles, but it might be easier for other people to just pick up which article you like and try to do this wiki version. Instead of doing everything for one article, we can share the work in this way that some people just find articles because they have more background on the subject, or it's easier for them to find articles, and the others that feel more comfortable with just choosing which article and writing about the articles. And I think having 2 weeks for each article is a good idea. And by the way, I just want to apologize. I have to leave earlier today, so I won't be able to spend 2 hours here. But yeah.
Well, thank you for those suggestions. We had exactly that in mind, Lola. And in fact, for the what we call it, seminar part of this session on the organization question, we were going to ask each of you which of the articles you liked the best or thought were most interesting, and to talk about it. And so that would be the beginning of a process like the one that you're suggesting. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Excellent, excellent. David, I see you nodding. I can't hear you.
Yes, I just unmuted. Yes, I like the process outline. Good. I like your tweed jacket too. Is that a Harris tweed, by the way?
In joke, David and I found ourselves sitting to each other at the London Social Forum in London. We were wearing the same jacket. And then it turns out
I wasn't wearing your jacket. No.
And it turned out he had just bought my book about beware sharks. So we became fast friends. So David, you were saying you're an old teacher too. Is this a better way of doing it?
No, I like what you and Lola said. So let's go. Let's do it.
Alexei, can I ask your opinion? Is Alexei vocal? Alexei, can you talk? Can you hear me? Alexei, raise your hand if you can hear me. You're muted. You can hear me, but I can't hear you.
Yes, now I. Okay.
I think we need to say back on Skype. It's not the same problem we had before.
Can you? Hello, can you hear me now?
No, not really.
Can you hear me?
Alexei, we are having a lot of problems hearing you and seeing you. I think we should go back to Skype like we tried 2 weeks ago.
Muted. So,
Okay, I will set that up in a moment.
Okay.
Okay, well, Alexei and others, Fred is setting up a Skype collection for Alexei in Moscow. Uh, 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 so, and Jason just came online.
Good morning.
Good morning. Jason, oh, yes, yes, yes. Delighted to see you. Jason, Fred and I have put forward some of the suggestions that you made when we spoke to each other this week about stretching out and doing more to do the wiki and so on. And so far, everybody has thought that these were good ideas. And so really the proposition is, should we do that by starting on December 3rd, our next to last meeting, instead of taking up a new topic, to digest, continue with organization, and that everybody puts something on the wiki from any topic, starting from the very beginning, just to get us all habit of writing anything, okay? And put it up there. We'll have 2 weeks to do that. If everybody commits to just putting something, transforming one of the writings quite simply into the past tense and placing it where it belongs, any place in the wiki. And then when we come back together on the 3rd, we can look at the work we've done and learn how to do it better. So that's the proposition. You're agreed to. Anybody that doesn't like that idea? Okay, well then that's what we're going to do. And the last, Dickie, I see you online there. This would be one problem is that you were preparing some things on the violence topic. Right. And again, it's a big topic. And what I'm suggesting is that we put it off until our January 7th meeting, when we reconvene after the holidays, and that we stretch it out to 2 weeks. How does that feel to you?
I think that's great because there's a lot of information on violence that goes not only from the turn of the 20th century, but more currently, given the change in how countries view war, as opposed to the way they viewed war, you know, in the early 1900s through the revolution of 1917 to now. And I think that there's a lot to understand the complexities of how countries view military action today, as opposed to, 100 years ago.
I agree.
One topic and one issue that sort of not bothered me, but I feel is lacking, or at least I don't know how to address in the arc of what we're trying to do, is the issue of effective communication and how, I look at it as in the last 37 or 40 years, rather, the right, especially in this country, have become so adept at communicating and manipulating the communication process. And I feel like I don't know if you've thought of that or how to address that in how to, when we talk about buildings, like the articles about swarming and all of these issues about building the global community, communication has to be at the very front. And it's not just simply, I think, the technical aspect, but the wording and phrasing that we use. Fred brought it up 2 weeks ago when he said, when I mentioned collectivism, and we talked about not, sort of getting away from the early vocabulary of the Marxists and the socialists. So I think that is something we should consider too, is building the vocabulary and how we communicate moving forward.
Dickie, I agree with you completely. And as you'll see, we've already started doing that.
Yeah.
We leave the term socialism and communism in the then part because we need to explain what was successful and what wasn't successful. Right?
Right.
But in the how and in the now, it's much more like I substituted the words caring and sharing from kindergarten in the piece that I put up on the future, and left socialism. And I use commonwealth and collect, just different words whenever I can. And I agree. Now, I want to ask you if you've got any advice to give us either now online or by writing because we're going to do something different in 2 weeks on December 3rd. And that is spend our hour discussing our own contributions that we've put online. Everyone's something. You've probably been to writers' workshops or stuff. I don't know. We don't know what we're doing, but we're doing it. Okay. So any help and advice is welcome.
The only advice that I have, and every week when I tune in, I'm sort of the academic last horse in this race. But fortunately or unfortunately, I'm the only one I think who ever built national advertising campaigns out of all of us. And to me, I keep thinking of ways that I can use the wording and the tactics or the advertising, if you will, that built capitalism to this place and how we could best use it against it. And that's sort of what I've been focusing on for the last few weeks is we can use, because I spend a lot of time, as you know, upstate in the Rust Belt. And these are people who 30 years ago were union workers and had strong unions and were diehard leftists, or at least Democrats in this country. And now my county up there went almost 70% for Trump.
Yeah.
So I sit in the diners and I listen to them talk, and they are not far away from their union roots, but the conversation from the right was so effective, and it makes them wonder and it makes them afraid. So this is the way they started to vote, because they actually see Trump as some sort of populist. So as a writer over the last few weeks, I've been trying to figure out ways that we can use their own tactics and writings of the right against them, and what are the phrasings and stuff that we can use. Hopefully I'll be able to put something up by the end of the week, but it seems like that is we have to basically use their weapons against them in some way, shape, or form in building this.
Dickie, I think that's a truly important subject that you brought up, and I think this is that you brought it up at the best time, because basically we've got 2 weeks to post our ideas and to do this by example, like maybe a story, part of the story where where you involve your neighbors in upstate and so on.
Maybe I just feel strongly because I just came out of 8 weeks of messaging for Democrats in 4 different campaigns up in Westchester. And I had to message basically to the same sort of crowd. And while Westchester's a bit more Democratic than upstate, still the same problems come about is how do you message an effective left program without frightening people away?
Right. Well, I'm sure that you can work out an imaginary solution to that problem, because that's what we're here for ultimately. And I really love it that we've got a real professional writer on our team.
Well, when you find him, let me know.
Yeah, Lola, speak.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that what you just said I think you can get some answers if you study, if you get into social psychology, because we study communication, and like even in marketing they use social psychology or psychological knowledge to build their messages. So I think that message framing is part of what we study. And I wrote an article, and I there is a study that was made in the United States that because the people usually from the right, they were more like in denial of climate change, and they saw that it was very hard to convince them to engage in environmental behaviors. So they try to understand how they view things, and generally people from the right are more they tend to justify the system more and try to defend the capitalistic system. So they try to frame the message in a way that was not making it as, oh, you need to change your behaviors, otherwise, because you need to change, like we need to change everything in our economy so that we can do more of like do something for climate change. And instead of saying that, they just said that you need to have more pro-environmental behaviors, otherwise. If you want to keep the way things are. So instead of making it appear as a change, they made it appear as a way of preserving the status quo, and it worked. And then they had more intention of engaging in environmental behaviors. So I think in understanding what are actually the true needs of people, you can communicate with them in a way that aim for these needs. And there's not one message that can work for everyone. There are subgroups of people who have different means and different strategies and different ways of looking at the world. And if you just build one message that it's directed at everyone, I think it's not going to work, because people react differently. And there was an example for climate change, but I think it works for pretty much everything else.
Everything you say, Lola, is absolute music to my ears. Especially coming from another writer who has already written a utopian novel. What I think we all agree with what you're saying, and what Vicky just said, and that's precisely our project.
Mm-hmm.
Then, now, and how to break through those barriers by using fresh vocabulary and fresh ways of expressing this collectivism, whatever you want to call it, caring and sharing. So what I would like you to do is see if you can transform that into the past tense, so that it appears in the how section of our scheme. Imagine how doing this has somehow changed things. And in any case, the important thing is that we do it, that we set an example, that we write something that everybody can read and that doesn't talk down or offend any people or put them off because of the propaganda that they've been subjected to. Does anyone else want to add to this? Okay, well then it looks like that's what we're going to do. We have 2 weeks to start adding stuff and talking about it too, how to do it and so on. We can share it on our listserv and help each other. I'll try to set some examples up. Maybe that'll make it easier. Now, Fred, will you chair this meeting as was planned, and so that with the time that we have remaining, and since we started late and Lola has to leave early, I'm glad we had this discussion first so that we know where we're headed together. Alexei is here on a Skype thing. Can we hear from him before we?
Yes.
Perfectly.
Put the mic down by the end.
also, I would recommend to structure our forum a little bit more precisely. Maybe to introduce the system of impulse contributions. For instance, one or two paired in advance contributions, then decide. As we start at the beginning.
Excuse me, could you make that more clear? I didn't quite understand what kind of contributions?
Yes.
Assigned contributions?
To introduce the system of impulse contributions, impulse presentations, like academic seminars. To see one or two prepared in advance contributions, and with the reading list, and then everybody can discuss to comment on that. So this is more structured.
Well, I'm still not sure. We've changed something so that everybody is sort of obliged to speak, and I'm not sure what you're suggesting. Maybe I'm just.
That's my suggestion.
Okay. Could you put it in writing in an email and make
Yes, but what is not clear?
Well, that's what's not clear is the unknown.
Okay,
So we move on now, Fred?
Yeah, let me change the.
Do you need the mic over there?
No, I'm good. Good morning. So I thought today we should, or at least one idea, since there's no, okay, let me back up a second. What Alexei, as I understood what Alexei was suggesting was that we, for future sessions, designate 2 or 3 presenters who would prepare more formal, a little more formal presentations on the material and then open it up for discussion. Unlike today, where we have no particular individual set up to present, we just have a series of texts that everyone, we hope, read, and we now have an opportunity to comment on those and elaborate on some of the points or present our own points of view about the materials in the texts. And so I thought we could just go left to right, at least briefly, and see what everyone thought of those, if they have particular things they want to bring up about one or another of the texts. I know David, we could start with David on the left here, and see what David has to say. And in particular, David actually did put up a couple of texts, one by Joe Freeman that's kind of a classic in this field in a way, and another that he has prepared himself. So I'll just turn it over to David if you can say a few words about these texts or anything else that came up in the course of the reading and the texts.
Oh, thank you, Fred. Yes.
David, turn down your speakers. Turn down your speakers.
What, mine?
Your local speakers. Turn down the speakers
Oh,
on
you
your.
can't hear me at all. Is that? Can you hear me now?
Not well.
Is that better? Okay. I hope I'm coming through now. I put up a few texts to read. One was a review of the book, the 2017 Socialist Register, which the author emphasized the need for a political party. And the other text I put up was Plan to Win, which was one version of a strategy to erode capitalism by radical reforms. Of course, we know that most capitalist countries, the time is not quite ripe for this to happen. But perhaps we'll look forward not sooner than later to this beginning in Great Britain, given the political situation there. So rather than going into detail there, I wanted to focus on something that I wrote, that I presented at the Left Forum, which was a forum to, the panel was focused on the concept of prefiguration. So this, the actual title was Stars on the Eco-Socialist Solar Communist Horizon, Ernst Bloch, Abdullah Öcalan, and Anna Dinestein. And contributions to this panel included Quincy Saul, who spoke about Öcalan's ideas. Kurt Stan had a very interesting presentation, which he's preparing as a paper on prefigurations in the trade union movement. And Joe Covell spoke as well and really provoked the audience. He spoke mainly about ideas of Ernst Bloch. And I sort of put together something on prefigurations of the transnational subject. So I am especially intrigued by the concept of the World Party, which originated with W. Warren Wager in a number of his writings, now almost 30 years ago. His most famous work was A Short History of the Future, which came out in 3 editions, and I would really suggest people take a look at that book, read that book. It's quite interesting, provocative. So I'm going to skip over a few things here, and I don't know if people took a look at my presentation, the PDF of my presentation, but of course we're all familiar with the 3 internationals, which were attempts, of course, at a global subject in terms of a challenge, in terms of with the project clearly to overthrow capitalism on a world scale. The last one, the third, of course, ended during World War II, actually the year of my birth, unfortunately, and as a result of the United Front Against Fascism during the war. And I would regard the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was an achievement coming out of World War II, as being a very important prefiguration of a post-capitalist world, because it's clear the rights that are outlined there have far from being realized for most of the people of the world, and can only be realized in a post-capitalist, what I would call an eco-socialist path out of capitalism. And this includes, of course, as well, other, oh, my phone is ringing, but I'm not going to answer it. This includes other international treaties regarding climate change, environmental protection, and biodiversity. Now, I did actually, in 1992, I wrote a piece for the Eco-Socialist Review. That was a short-lived publication, but it was kind of, I'm sorry about the interference. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Okay, so the other, an important lesson actually comes from the experience of the Transnational Radical Party, which was basically a neoliberal libertarian party, but it did gain status and pretended to be actually a transnational party because it had members of legislatures from all over the world at one time. So it did get status equivalent to the International Red Cross in the UN, so it was able to actually introduce resolutions to the General Assembly. And that may be something we could look forward to in the early stages of constructing a more robust transnational movement. Then here's really the heart of, I guess, what I want to say today, and that is the critique, Jody Dean's book, Crowds and Party, which just came out last year. Now, to be clear, Jody Dean is actually a member of the Party of Socialism and Liberation, which is calls itself a Marxist-Leninist party. I've worked with members here in DC, some of which are leaders in the struggle for affordable housing and so forth. And they have a very, I won't get into any more about that party, but the essence of what she argues is that horizontalism, as exemplified by the Occupy movement, has great, let's say, had great impact, but in a short term, and did not have the continuity that is needed to move forward with a strong political challenge to capitalism. And that's why she went back to talk to, actually, much of the book is actually an account of the experience of the US Communist Party, which my parents were members of. And the experiences actually struck me kind of on an emotional level too, because the feeling, the motivation of people like my dad in the communist movement of really in the 1940s and early 1950s was actually motivated by an anticipation of a socialist US. He actually believed that this is possible in his lifetime. Unfortunately, he died too soon to see it happen, and I hope I'll be around. Maybe I'm a wishful thinker, but I think it's a valuable work to confront. Now, I don't necessarily agree with the model that she proposes, and I certainly do not agree with just reviving the democratic social centralist model of a communist party for this time. However, I think that the positive achievements of that kind of organization with voluntary enthusiasm of its members achieved quite a bit. And not only in the United States, of course, in other countries as well. So we should look, I think, critically at the positive and the negative. Obviously, the biggest negative of the experience of 20th century communist movement was the top-down dictation from the Soviets, and how individual parties had to follow that line, often to the detriment of their own struggles. And I could give one example. What happened in the Middle East, we know that the Soviets initially supported Israel and actually pushed the Arab communist parties to follow that line. That outcome was not very positive regarding the strengthening of the Zionist movement, which eventually became a strong ally of the US imperialists. So I think we should rethink the party as an actor, looking at both the positive and the negative experiences of the past. But we should not abandon the an organizational form, which I think is best represented by the concept of a world party, and where it articulates and advances the common interests of all humanity, not in contradiction to the struggles of individual movements and parties in different countries. I think we do need a transnational formation which acts in that way. And I'm almost done, basically. And that, I had one of my slides actually kind of critiques Jody Dean in making the point that if we're talking about transnational and multidimensional class struggle, we need not a homogeneous structure, we need a heterogeneous structure with different alignments, with different alliances, and not trying to impose one brand on the whole, one structure on the whole apparatus. Obviously, the role of nation states continues to be very important, and and should not be submerged by simply by advancing a transnational political movement. The two should be synergistic, in other words. And there's a lot to be learned in this regard. And I think there's a lot of experiences that have to be studied in coming to a more concrete formation. But I think that, and I'll just conclude by saying that just a couple of weeks ago, I returned from Venezuela from the first Eco-Socialist International Convocation. I'm not going to make too much of that experience, but I won't make too little either. I think it was an important beginning, an embryo of actually developing this kind of transnational movement. And finally, in terms of going back, I didn't have a chance to comment on the earlier discussion, but very briefly, the product that we come out with, I think, should reflect what Lola was pointing out. Different constituencies, different communities perceive language differently. I certainly think that the youth, especially in the United States, with the Democratic Social America now enjoying a membership of over 30,000, which is unprecedented in recent history, that these new millennials like me, have certainly inspired by many of them by eco-socialism. They're not, it doesn't help to avoid saying socialism. It certainly helps, and that, of course, Bernie's campaign really had a great service in making that term kosher, to use going back to my Jewish background. So we should respect the diversity of messaging and be able to use this messaging. Anyway, those are some thoughts. I hope they were some useful and provocative. I'm going to mute myself.
David, thanks very much. I would like to move it over to Sam Fassbender, who pointed out that he wrote a review of Jody Dean's book, Crowds and Party. So maybe we can continue on that thread for a moment with Sam.
Oh, I'd kind of like to hear what other people have to say about some of the documents you all posted, because I really didn't have much time or energy to read them this week. Mostly I've been sort of straightening out some of the stuff that I wrote for the chapter of my book on Aldous Huxley, and also, to try to create a proposal for the book as soon as I can, to have something to send to Jason, who says he might be able to hook me up with some kind of East Coast academic press to get the thing published in. I'm really kind of interested in this conference that David mentioned about, I guess where Joel Covell spoke about Ernst Bloch, because I'm still kind of working through Ernst Bloch for one of the chapters, which I suppose you could all look at some later point. Did you say the next meeting was in 2 weeks? That's probably a good idea. Yeah, at any rate, so I'm sorry for being such a laggard on this. I haven't really spent a whole lot of time on this stuff, but yeah, I'd like to hear from the others and on the topics that I've mentioned.
Okay,
I guess I'll yield.
I'm gonna see if Jason Hicks would like to say something on this.
Yeah, trying to prepare something more formal because I mean, they might not be good, but I've got a lot of thoughts about this. And I'll keep it brief with the problem of, like, sometimes brief comments can sound more pointed than I intend them to sound. But I would say, is everyone still okay? Fred's camera's down, but I assume I can still keep going.
What?
So, I mean, I think it's a difficult question, but that, like, a lot of the readings kind of pose it as horizontal versus vertical. And I would just say, I mean, nobody wants, like, an anti-democratic structure. So the problem isn't really in general convincing people that. The problem is that, I mean, the point Jody Dean makes and plenty of people make is that horizontalism doesn't solve the problem of continuity is true. I mean, Jody Dean, I didn't know she was in the PSL, if that's true. I'm glad I didn't like her first book. I mean, like, dealing with union work a lot. Like, when you first start an organizing campaign, somebody has to start it. Like, you don't just immediately start with a vote of the whole workplace. Sorry, my dog is jealous that I'm talking to y'all. Like, somebody has to start what you're doing. And you want to, over time, develop structures. And that's, I uploaded Joe Freeman's Tyranny of Structurelessness, that you need, if you're having any, you know, if it's 10 people like this, you can just do consensus or whatever you want. But if it's more than that, to have effective participation, you need some kind of structure. Sorry, let me put my dog down. And just in terms of class, like working class, a lot of the participatory democratic models are interesting, but they favor people that have lots of free time. So it can actually be anti-democratic in the sense of looking at the people we want to involve in certain projects. And so the party stuff David talks about is interesting I mean, I'm not against the party form per se. I think it's better to think, though, in terms of, like, whether we agree or disagree, though, with what David said, what does that change about what we're doing both in this particular project, but also in our day-to-day organizing? To present not necessarily a different model, but it relates to the messaging question earlier. The recent electoral wins of socialists in elections were mainly through, it was partly the message that reached people of, like, healthcare, single-payer healthcare, but it was mainly, I think, just the fact that people went and knocked on people's doors and talked to them face to face. So the right wing relies on messaging campaigns because it's manipulating things. It's presenting, like, it's telling them that they have to be afraid of immigrants and that immigrants are the reason their lives suck, even though capitalism is the reason their life sucks. So the right wing is dependent upon messaging campaigns. I think what the left wing has to be dependent on is actually talking to people face to face, versus a lot of left wing political work is us talking to each other, which what we're doing right now, talking to each other, is hopefully useful, but that can't be the core of what we do. And so I want to write up more about this. There's particular groups like New Haven Rising in Connecticut where the union has won a majority of seats on the city council by just going on, knocking on people's doors, asking what they want, telling them what they can, you know, what they can win by going out and voting and stuff like this. And so it's not electoralist, and they're not saying we're going to solve all your problems through voting, but it is based on getting people talking to each other and participating in both protest, union organizing, and elections in a way that isn't, you can't say it's horizontalism, but it's not vertical. It's people organizing themselves in each other, developing leadership, developing committees, developing structures to like change society.
Okay, there's been a request by David that Sam actually say something about your review of Jody Dean's book. I wonder if Sam, I want to put you on the spot, Sam, but we would like to hear a little bit about that review. I know you're going to post it for us to read later.
Right. Well, I sent it in an email to future historians, so you can all just forward the email. Okay. I sent the proofs, right? I went through my documents in my computer and I found the proofs and I sent the proofs, so you can read the proofs. There might be a little red ink there that the editors. Anyway, thanks, Lola. At any rate, Dean occasionally admits in this book that the so-called left is nearly moribund. I mean, you know, you have socialist party. Am I getting feedback?
Yeah, we can hear you. You're fine.
It's not my feedback. Oh, wait a minute. It is my feedback. I'll turn my speakers down. Okay, that Dean occasionally admits that the so-called left in this country, at least on the federal level, is nearly moribund. And or at least that was the way it appeared to me at the time of writing of the book. Of course, the real problem was that the so-called left in this country basically has a pillow on its heads, well chloroformed, of course, by this sort of pseudo left that appears in the context of the Democratic Party, and the people who you have plenty of people in this country who like to talk up a nice leftist chat, but when it comes to actually voting for somebody who represents their interests, they instead opt to vote for lesser of two evils candidates. Okay, and so the left ends up supporting the right. And I thought that the book was admirable for that purpose, but generally what I tried to do in the review is to describe the abstract house of cards that Dean sets up, right? So that you have crowds, right? And this discussion of crowd psychology, and you have party, which is this idealization that Dean carries with her of the Communist Party. Of course, the Communist Party doesn't necessarily need to be named Communist Party, but it needs to be a party, and it needs to have some idea of communism behind it. In real life, Dean actually supported Bernie Sanders. At any rate, that was kind of how I tried to describe the book, that it was this rather abstract discussion of the social psychology of a somewhat idealized notion of the party, and that I don't know where to go beyond that. I think that was what it was really, the book was really about. You can read the review yourselves and make up your mind about it.
You're muted, Fred.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. We're
How they could hear and understand what other people speaking, except Richard, because Richard is excluded. So I can make some remarks concerning the subject organization and the texts which were prepared for the debate. I think that Richard, in his text, made very useful and very good summary of what a democracy of network can be. And if socialism is a direct involvement of people in decision making concerning their own lives, so this involvement needs an institutional framework, institutional structures. And this democracy of networks, as Richard put it, needs the very adequate form for that can function with the help of contemporary technologies like internet and so on. And transition to socialism itself is nothing but about extending democracy through widening its scope in two dimensions. First, including new spheres, as we know, the extension of democracy from pure political realm to the realm of social and economic life. And also another dimension, which means involving maximum possible number of people. And we can quote Lenin, who defined the so-called commune state as nothing but generally organized workers. I would add organized in democratic and voluntary manner. But there are preconditions for such general organization of workers or people, and this precondition is not only the further development of technology in order to have this referendum online in real time and so on and so forth, but also there is a precondition in development of people's consciousness and people's culture. I think this is at the present stage, we can't expect a person to participate in economic planning, for instance, through the internet and these horizontal networks, if this person has no knowledge of basic economic categories and things, or a person is just not interested in that, in debating. For instance, he prefers to go and play football or sleep than to discuss economic and political stuff. And people are also not prepared for that since they don't have previous experience of public activities. Therefore, I think that in order this conception of horizontal networks, democracy, planning from below and so on becomes practical, people has to go through some previous stages. In, for instance, I mean, person can participate in its or her or his local community structure, or the local union, or the political organization, political party. This is very important and necessary steps in order to raise ourselves to the next stage, the stage of this advanced horizontal and democratic networks. And sometimes even simple education is needed to participate in such activities. So in short, a society has to reach a certain level of development and or to become ripe economically, socially, politically, and culturally to use modern technologies in socialist way as an instrument for socialist democracy. This is, I repeat, the classical Marxist conception of the precondition, of the basis for objective basis for social transformation. In other case, these modern technologies like internet can be used for reactionary purposes, by reactionary forces. And Richard mentioned that in his article, where he says that ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they know how to use internet to recruit and so on, to disseminate their crazy propaganda through these advanced technologies. And this happens in Arab world. We see that the Arab Spring, yes, it's toppled some dictatorship, but what came out of it? In Egypt, we have the same military dictatorship, almost military dictatorship. In other words, we see the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. That means that technologies in itself are not enough. Yes, the development of social subject is the most important. Technologies and organizational forms at all, they're just instruments. Instruments that can be used for different ends. Another thing which I would like to stress is that the form of organization used in political and social struggles normally depends on conditions and concrete circumstances under which these organizations function. One situation is politically free country, where you can have all kinds of organizations from ad hoc or permanent network with certain functional specialization to political parties of more traditional type. But if there is an authoritarian, not to speak about totalitarian regime, so the completely different form organization would be needed. Well, for instance, in Russia in the beginning of 20th century, when the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was formed, the only possible organizational form was a conspiratorial centralized party where such things as elections to party committees was hardly realizable. Or in contemporary Russia, where you just cannot have possibilities for open mass political activities. And the only possible form of organization is a club or a network of clubs. So all depends on concrete situation. There is no universal form of organization suitable for every task in every time. But if we are talking exactly of the transformation of society in direction to socialism, of course the organization for such a task should be adequate to a task of building society based on principles of freedom, democracy, and equality. Here we can also quote historical examples. For instance, in the mid-19th century in Russia, there was an anarchist group called People's Carnage, organized by Sergei Nechayev. And the task of this group is to bring anarchy, the absolute freedom and equality. But it was organized in totalitarian fashion. And if you organize in totalitarian fashion, you will not bring anarchy. The same can be said about Lenin's party. If you have a party organized with the criminalization of internal debate and the control of leadership over the rank and file, you will not build socialism. You will arrive to Stalinism. So this organizational form should be adequate to the task. That's, I think, very important thing. That's the end for now.
Very good.
Let me just turn this up here, yeah, so that I can see myself.
Yes. Okay.
So I appreciate all that's been said here. David, your description of how the World Party could develop and so on, and also your description about how local participation and so on. The latter, it seems to me, connects clearly with Bookchin's idea of municipal socialism. And what I would like to do is suggest that for our next meeting on December 3rd, that you develop both of those ideas in terms of a narration that would fit into the how, okay? So that you'll show how municipal socialism, or whatever you want to call it, led into different things and was a progressive force. And then perhaps in both how and in now, the future, you flesh out that wonderful novel and the idea of the world party. I think that would be terrific. Let me see. To get to the, Alexei, I completely agree with what you said. And that brings us down to the main point here about this horizontal versus vertical. All right, let me say this about the word party, because we began this discussion with first Lola and then Dickie warning us that these words from the past can get us in a lot of trouble. And indeed, people, when they hear about parties, they generally stop listening, because they see parties of ways for corrupt politicians to get rich or dominate or whatever it is, that it's a game. That's a perfectly good reason to avoid the word. On a deeper basis, historically looked at objectively, all parties appear in the arena, whether clandestine and armed or electoral and legal, have one purpose: to take power, to control the state, and presumably the people that are at the top of the party are the ones who get to hold the controls and steer the ship of state. So this goes for those that want to make a coup d'etat, for those that want to get a parliamentary majority, those that promise reform, or those that promise revolution. Their existence of parties can only be conceived of within the context of the existing capitalist nation-state system. So this is a very, very serious thing. And so, although everybody here agrees, we have no problem with agreement. I might stress more sudden revolutionary transformations. David Schwartzman, because of his own involvements and his own history, is more interested in reformist struggles that will give the masses some taste of what power could be like, some way of organizing themselves and expressing their demands. And so this is very, very important, and can, especially in times of bifurcation and so on. So in our pluralistic way, we can put on our wiki that shows how we got from here to there. All of these things happening simultaneously. But I do think that we need to avoid the word party, because it only has a sense in the midst of, in the context of getting the controls of the state. And you can see where it's led to. And almost by definition, this party leads to a one-party situation. Now, parties or groups in a multi-party situation can have a certain positive role, not so much in organizing, but in expressing programs, a number of possible choices that will help people orient themselves in their on-the-ground struggles that take place, in my opinion, in self-organized Soviets, mass assemblies, whatever, all these different things. And so, following a cue to Peter Hudis, who was kind enough to read my manuscript, and I think if you see it in the Dropbox, you'll see Peter's comments on it. Okay, Peter reminds me of something that I always knew, that the word party has two meanings. One is a specific party, like the Democratic Party or the Nazi Party, okay? And we know what that is. It's a bureaucracy that aims at taking power. But the other, for example, the anti-slavery party, right? The abolitionists and the party of order, the guys that come and get you when you try to dissent. All through the 18th and 19th century. In fact, before the modern bureaucratic party got started, that was what party meant. And for Marx, in some joking thing I think I heard, said it was reduced to him and Engels at a certain point. But what did he mean by that? The party is the expression of a philosophy. And so for Marx, it was finally the abolition of wage labor, the abolition of capital, which can only exist by endless growth and endless expansion of accumulation. So I think more than parties, what's called for is like magazines, organizations that call for have a certain viewpoint and that are available in the free market of ideas or even passed around on underground pamphlets. Some vision of where people could go, where their interests are, whom to support in elections if that's the way it is. In other words, perhaps around a newspaper, okay? My tradition comes from C.L.R. James and Raya Dunayevskaya and Socialisme Barbarie, and they got the idea from my friends in Detroit, where I was active for a while, the idea of workers' journals. And indeed, Rosa Luxemburg, she said that any kind of popular paper ought to have at least half of it readers' views. That is to say, solicit from people what they thought about the situation. And it went without question that all of the press, party press they called it then, was open to debate between dissidents within the party and the current leadership. So Fred is telling me that I have to wind up. I think that nobody here wants a vanguard party. Nobody here thinks, apparently, that that is the way to go, because ultimately the world that we make is dependent on the form of organization that we have created, self-organization, that will ultimately overthrow capitalism and, yes, take power. Yes, take power. There's no doubt that that has to happen, but it has to happen democratically. Now, I'll finish in replying to Alexei's very, very pertinent comment. Unless the mentality of people changes, unless planetary consciousness, which we're going to be looking at a little later in the semester or next semester, unless that changes, clearly people won't be ready to go into that participatory democracy on a planetary scale. But then we have to ask ourselves, how did the people get there? The only possible way that we can conceive in this scholars group that they could get there would be through democratic self-organization. And so the how determines the now. And so since I've got to end here, I just want to say that the best way to put this forward is in our own activity, that we, by creating an imaginary but plausible world, will point people in the right directions. And that our only rule, and this is in our founding document, is that the result has to be consistent with the process. That is to say that means determine ends, and certain ends can only be arrived at by certain means. And so we've been proved right in forming this seminar, because Dave and I, who have always had different activities, complementary, but not in the same party, so to speak, are here in perfect harmony. And rather than being sectarian and expelling each other, my purpose is to encourage him to express this in a narrative, in a form that will give people courage and hope and a good direction, a choice of directions. Okay, I'm done.
Okay, so two folks have their hands up. Sam Friedman is next. Unmute your mic, Sam.
Sam, can't hear you.
You're muted.
Okay.
You're muted.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, good. Been a very interesting discussion. I want to point to the ways in which some of what Jason said and Alexei said and Richard said are not connecting to each other. And Richard touched on that in what he just said at the end of what he said. Much of our activity has to be organizing of various kinds. Labor places, community places, various kinds of organizing. We also need to create images and concepts of what we're trying to create and get them out there. But the other thing which, Alexei spoke to is what is the process by which things are most likely to change? Because as we do all this, we will try to build the strongest mental presence in people's minds and create language and images that help them to move forward. Always the problem that anything we say is almost hopelessly abstract until we have organizations powerful enough actually to be able to talk in terms like, what if this kind of organization takes over the running of this part of the world, or by which I mean this aspect of life. Now, I think, I've been thinking a lot about Argentina and what it went through at the early years of this century. The Arab Spring and the Ukrainian Maidan movement, all of which were examples of successful political revolutions in the sense of they upended the ruling groups in the state, and to some extent threw the nature of the state into question. And I put something, into one of the folders last night. I thought we were on another topic, so I put it in the wrong folder, the planetary consciousness folder, where I was doing some musings about that. People may want to read it. It seems to me that we have to be organized in a way that lets us, in episodes like those, have a presence and establish a presence. And that does mean a certain degree of organizing and having a certain degree of political unity, which is, when David was talking about what he liked about the Communist Party in somebody's image of it, or what I liked, for example, in my activities in the 1970s when I was a member of what was then the International Socialists, and we organized Teamsters for a Democratic Union and Labor Notes and some other stuff, was we were organizing, we had a presence, we were affecting the real world. We were in no way, shape, or form prepared for a revolutionary situation, and probably shouldn't have been with some of our other cockamamie ideas. But I think that when I ask myself, what do we need to create? We need to create a presence that can intervene in those circumstances. Because we don't have that much to do with creating the uprisings. But when the uprisings come, we have to be ready and have enough support already so that for our ideas, so that we can intervene and have some impact. And most importantly, that when those things come up, we and other people can organize some kind of subject, some kind of democratic subject. Call it a council movement, call it whatever. That's got to be the first thrust of our activity. Now, and by doing that, we're creating something in terms of which we can say, this object that we have created, that is we, could actually implement some of those ideas that we put forward in the various documents we write. Now, at that point, I think we do need something like a party form, by which I do not mean something to take state power or anything like that, but within the councils, to work for the councils taking power, and then setting up some kind of new democratic rule over the world, and to spread it. I mean, I think those are just unavoidable necessities, because the capitalists are going to be doing what they can to destroy us, and the social democratic or liberal structures in the unions are going to be doing what they can to destroy these objects. And we have to be all simply, in the contest of ideas, beat that. So that's what I want to contribute this time. Except one other thing. I have been writing on these topics for a number of years, and will, over time, as this goes along, put stuff in the in the drop boxes for it. Some of what I've been writing is a different approach to language, which is my poetry. Some of which I think Richard was going to put in the drop box, and I hope it's useful to people. And with that, I'll shut up.
Sam, thanks very much. We're really glad to have you join us, and clearly you have a lot to say that's going to help us along the way. I wanted to respond to both you and Richard a little bit, and maybe David too. I put up several things in the Dropbox, one of which was an article, a couple of articles, excerpts from an article by Salar Mohandasi about 1917. And about, in particular, the situation that arose between July and October, when in July the masses of Petrograd workers came out onto the streets and were sick and tired of the continuation of the war and the failure of the provisional government to take any steps to end it, and came out on the streets really in favor of the slogan that had already been launched several months before of the Bolsheviks, to all power to the Soviets. And the Bolshevik activists and party organization were not ready, were not able to take advantage of that situation. And as a result, the movement was crushed, and the Bolsheviks were driven into an underground existence for a number of months. Lenin had to flee to Finland. And when he did, he wrote State and Revolution. And the situation then arose finally in October, when the opportunity arose again for the Soviets to come to power. So it was the Soviets as councils, as organizations that grouped masses of workers and that provided delegation and representation, But it was also the initiative that was finally taken by a party. You can call it a small p party or a large p party, but certainly a group of leaders of this movement that had arisen that took the initiative to finally put an end to the provisional government and bring the power fully into the hands of the Soviets. Now, many other things happened after that that we are certainly well aware of. But certainly I think we're getting at the point where that Sam raised at the decisive moment, is there some form of organization or some grouping of leaders who can take the initiative to bring things to a climax and actually bring working people to power. And that is, I think, probably where we may have some differences and where we may need to hone in on what those might be. But you know, certainly horizontalism and spontaneity and councils and you know, a vast range of different kinds of organizations that arise in the course of struggles are critical and important and indispensable. But I think also indispensable is being able to coordinate and take the initiative and move at the decisive moment. And that is what's been missing from so many of these horizontalist experiences over the past decade or so. Let me turn to I know David had his hand up and wanted to say something in response to Richard as well. So I'll move it to David.
Thanks. I just want to thank everyone for what they had to say. I find little to disagree with, believe me. And I really appreciate everyone's points that were made. I want to correct something I said. I think I said that I thought Jody Dean was a member of the Party of Socialists and Liberation. I don't know that for a fact. He certainly works closely with that organization and was a speaker at the People's Congress of Resistance that I participated in. I want to read a very brief passage from Jody Dean's book, Crowds and Party, which I think really addresses the issues that were just made, the points just made. By disrupting business as usual, the crowd initiates a gap between what is and what could be. The party holds open that gap. It, quote, holds open a political space for the production of a common political will. The party is not only a fact of oppositional collectivity, but a tool for deepening critical self-reflection, seeing themselves from the perspective of the party. Members can sense their political horizons expanding. The party is an anti-capitalist, quote, place from which a collective can look at itself and assess its strengths and weaknesses on its own terms. It sharpens members' political consciousness and pushes them to act in collective rather than individual interest. The party makes the crowd into something more than it is. It gives the crowd a history, letting its egalitarian moment endure in a subjective process of people's struggle. And I want to actually support Richard's point that I would not see this as an advocacy for one vanguard party, rather parties that compete. And I don't like the term marketplace of ideas. I think that Richard appropriated from the bourgeoisie, but I know what his intention was. Certainly competition of ideas. And as we know, the Bolsheviks won the support of the Soviets in 100 years ago. Now, what happened after is another matter, but there was a competition between different political views there, between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks and so on. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you for a little extra time.
Someone else?
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm on. The hour is coming to a close, and I think this has been a very fruitful discussion, and partly because we had really excellent materials to work with, and partly because people are now participating more. What the next phase is for every one of you to transform what you've written in the past, for example, the two Sams, just take the trouble over the next 2 weeks to cut out something from what you've written in the past and reshape it so that it becomes part of a narrative of then, now, and how. And take any topic, the topic we're working on today, because it's right in front of us now, but any other topic, and so that when we meet again, each one of us will have something to criticize, and we can mush them all together, and you'll see, I believe, that they'll be complementary. Now, one last point. I didn't particularly like that article that starts with a wonderful description of the July days and points out how it may have been too early, but it was clear that the masses had organized themselves, not just in the workers, but also the peasants and the soldiers, that they had had enough. And all power to the Soviets didn't come from the Bolsheviks, it came from the Soviets. And the author contradicts himself, because in the second part of the paper, he says, well, this would never have happened in 1917 without the Bolsheviks. Well, in fact, it might have happened differently, but, and in fact, it wasn't only the Bolsheviks, but the SRs. And Serge points out that the organized takeover in Petrograd was relatively bloodless, whereas in Moscow, without an organization and the communists were there, but they didn't organize it, it was a disaster. So clearly organization is very, very important. And our job is not to go out and organize the workers. We were doing that in the 70s, me too. I was a member of News and Letters, and I used to go to factories and give out our paper, which combined stories written in the struggle with Raya Dunayevskaya's Marxism, humanism. And people began taking the paper. And I ended up involved in a big wildcat strike and became a member of the United Black Brothers of Morwar's Fords, the most modern and biggest Ford plant on the East Coast. And that was then. I was in my 20s. But right now, most of us are pretty old, and those of us that are young, it's not the same situation. Now is the time for us to look back on our experience, which is rich, and then project it forward and show how under other circumstances that are quite predictable, all these different forms might come forward, because our precious elixir, our secret knowledge that we need to pass on to new generations is what we've learned from our defeats. And if we can project them into the future, then that is our principal task, not to go out and organize the workers. They'll organize themselves. The Soviets were ignored by the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks when they developed in 1917, and in 1905, excuse me. And they sprung up again, and let's not forget it, in Hungary in 1956. So the workers will find their way to some forms of organization. We must be present in that organization. We must support it. And we and others like us, different parties, should inject it into it, the two things that Marx and Engels say in the original Communist Manifesto, where they say, we're not here to be a sect. We bring to the struggle two things: the view of a future, that is to say, that this particular struggle is not over here and now, but continues and leads to a different world, and the international perspective, that maybe we'll win some gains for skilled white workers here, but wait a minute, what about the workers of color? What about the women? What about the people in other countries? So those are the two things that we bring, plus 2 centuries of experience that we can project into the future and share. So I hope that everybody is going to cannibalize these wonderful articles that have been posted, cannibalize their own writings, which I'm going to do since I've been at this for a long, long time. And I'm just going to say one more thing. Should we put them directly on the wiki, or do you want them put in the Dropbox? I think we should go right to the wiki, frankly. Let's have a show of hands. Alexei, are you raising your hand?
I prefer Dropbox.
All right, then everyone will do it the way she or he wants to. But what? Okay, we'll send out an email, we'll have a discussion. But I want to sort of break the terror of going on the email, of putting it out in public in that way. I think we'll find that it'll be fun, and that every minute of the day, if you think of a good idea for the future, just open Future Historians and put it on the wiki. The point of the wiki is that we can change everything, and it would be nice to see how the different variety of things people think of will harmonize themselves. So goodbye for 2 weeks, and have a nice holiday. Well, that's an American holiday, right?
You're muted, Fred. Fred, you're muted.
Is that better? Hello, 1, 2, 3. Okay, good. Sorry. I'm going to copy and paste the chat from this session into a document on the Dropbox for this session, because there were some side conversations going on from time to time that are worth taking a look at. And well, I'll actually just edit that and put it in the listserv on our Google Groups, our new Google Groups that we also launched this week. So until next time, unless anyone has something critical to add, we're out of here. 1, 2, 3. Bye, comrades.
Bye-bye, let's say. Happy holidays.